Reporters' sources, tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN.
The Warren Commission released its report on the Kennedy assassination 40 years ago. In September, the Assassination Archives and Research Center hosted a symposium on the Commission's findings. This panel looked at possible connections to the CIA. This is a little over an hour.
This afternoon, we have with us Jefferson Morley, who is a reporter for the Washington Post and has written a series of articles over the past 2 or 3 years which have made stunning revelations, in particular about the CIA's obstruction of the probe by the House Select Committee on Assassinations. John Newman, as most of you know, is a former major in Army intelligence. He's now a professor at the University of Maryland. He's a longtime researcher, has been doing seminal work on the case for many years. The two of them are combining as sort of a tag team this afternoon to give you presentations on what the Warren Commission missed, unwitting participants, and unindicted co-conspirators.
Thank you, Jim. Is that working? Is that? Thank you, Jim. John and I decided to team up today because of our mutual interest in the CIA and the Kennedy assassination, and in particular in an area that we have done a lot of work on together and apart on what CIA personnel and officials knew about Lee Harvey Oswald before the assassination. So we're going to run through that today. Just by way of introduction, or setting the scene for what we're talking about, I think that this conference is helpful, useful, and important because it brings together, on the 40th anniversary of the Warren Commission, a snapshot of the continuing decomposition of the credibility of the Warren Commission report. We've long known that the substantial, solid majority of the people, of the American people, are skeptical of and reject the Warren Report's conclusions. Thanks to David Talbot, we have a more complete picture now of how the political elite privately shared many of those suspicions. Lyndon Johnson, Bobby Kennedy, Fidel Castro, Richard Nixon, J. Edgar Hoover. For the purposes of our conversation today, the one point I would like to note is that many of these people, despite their very different ideological perspectives and mindsets, came together to arrive at a general conclusion that the assassination had somehow originated in the world of Cuban-American politics. What we are going to look at today is what CIA officials knew about Lee Harvey Oswald before the assassination and how they responded and how they handled that knowledge afterwards. And John's going to pick it up here.
The fine work of the Assassination Records Review Board has given us nearly 6 million pages of new documents. A lot of the material is new and includes significant evidence from CIA records, evidence withheld from the Warren Commission. While the evidence in these records is insufficient to determine who the ultimate perpetrators of the crime were, it is sufficient to establish that Oswald's Cuban escapades were part of the plot. The documents make it clear that many CIA officers became enmeshed in these escapades, both in New Orleans and Mexico City, and at headquarters after the president's murder, covering it up. We know of at least a dozen such officers at the CIA. Due to time constraints, Jeff and I will identify several of them, but only talk about 3 in more detail. We believe 2 of these CIA officers were unwitting participants, and the 3rd was an unindicted co-conspirator in the conspiracy to kill JFK. It was their job to know about Oswald and to take action concerning him with respect to the incoming reports on his Cuban capers before Kennedy was killed. While unwitting in the plot, their collective responses played a significant role in the intelligence failure that culminated in the president's murder. In a nutshell, a CI officer that Jeff will discuss shortly manipulated Oswald in a manner to establish the story that Oswald was an agent of Castro, while still others at CI headquarters that I will discuss took actions that suppressed that story from the Mexico City station. They did this at the very moment Oswald went to Mexico City to put his Cuban story in play, in a failed attempt to obtain a visa to go there, to Cuba. You may draw me out further on this in the Q&A, but I'm going to move along. What the station learned about Oswald's Cuban contacts in Mexico City, they reported to headquarters. Those reports and the taped phone conversations of a conspirator who impersonated Oswald to further link him to Castro and the Kremlin were destroyed and covered up by CIA headquarters after the president's murder. While these reports and tapes were thus destroyed, the story itself was not. President Johnson used it to force Earl Warren and others to take part in a national security cover-up. I will deal with that part shortly. But first, let's take a closer look at some of the CI officers who handled the Oswald Cuban Student Director DRE story before the assassination.
For the purposes of this discussion here, I'm going to start on August 1st, 1963. On that day, a man named George Joannides was promoted to become the chief of the psychological warfare staff in the JM Wave station of the CIA in Miami. George Joannides at that time was 40 years old. He was a 10-year veteran of the clandestine service. He reported directly to Deputy Director Richard Helms. Five days after, chief among his duties in Miami was handling of the CIA contacts with one of the most prominent and effective anti-Castro exile organizations, the Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil, Student Revolutionary Directorate, also known in the American press as the Cuban Student Directorate, and sometimes by its initials DRE. In CIA files that Joannides generated on the group was known by the code name AMSPEL. This is Joannides' fitness report. You can see that it was written on July 31st, 1963, the day before he took over. And you can see in the bottom line, he's the case officer for a student project involving, and these are important terms, political action, propaganda, and intelligence gathering. Those are important because 5 days later, Lee Harvey Oswald wanders into the New Orleans chapter of the DRE and announces that he wants to help them in their fight against Castro. This is Oswald, the alleged leftist. The DRE rebuffs his advance and begins to engage in intelligence collection on Oswald. They send people out to find out who he is. Political action. They accost him handing out leaflets on the corner. They challenge him to a debate on the radio. They tape the debate on the radio. And then propaganda. They put out a press release denouncing Oswald and calling for a federal investigation of his activities. This is 3 months before he allegedly assassinated President Kennedy. At the time, Joannides was supplying the group with up to $25,000 a month. That's probably about $150,000 a month in today's money. And the DRE, his assets, the AMSPEL assets, proceed to do the intelligence collection, keep tabs on Oswald, and make a big deal of his pro-Castro connections. These incidents draw the attention, the street fight between the DRE members and Oswald draws the attention of the FBI, and the incident is taken seriously by federal authorities. We don't know Joannides' response to that. The records of his activities in August 1963 are missing from the CIA files, but we do know that the report on Oswald and the DRE was forwarded to Washington. And now John will pick up the story here.
In a second, yeah.
No.
Just turn it off. Yeah. Okay.
Can't we just turn that off?
Oh, no.
We don't need to see your favorite quarterback. There we go. All right. That FBI report on Oswald and the DRE, as well as another one earlier on his FPCC activities in Dallas before he went to New Orleans, were sent to CIA headquarters in Washington. And the one on Oswald and the DRE landed on the desk of Jane Roman on October the 4th. Jane was a liaison officer working in James Angleton's counterintelligence staff. The Oswald DRE story then went to two officers working at the counterintelligence section of the agency's Cuban affairs staff, the SAS. Might as well put that up now, Rex. And it stayed there for 3 important days, the 8th, 9th, and 10th of October. During those 3 days, it was during those 3 days that CIA headquarters and its Mexico City station exchanged cables on Oswald and his escapades in Mexico. Talking about right here. This is the 8th, 9th, and 10th. And both of these individuals work in the counterintelligence section of the Special Affairs Staff. That's where the Oswald DRE story was sitting in the CIA at the time that the station and headquarters exchanged information on Oswald. Now, in the Mexico City station, that's a cover sheet, by the way. You're looking at a cover sheet to that DRE report. The report, the FBI report that we're talking about, this is the routing sheet that people sign for when they read the documents, and this one in particular was that FBI report. When the Mexico City station, after discovering Oswald's activities there, asked headquarters who he was, the headquarters response was authored by John Whitten, alias John Celso. Here's his signature right here on the bottom of the cable that was sent from headquarters. He was the agency's chief of covert operations for Mexico and Central America. Now, Jane Roman participated in the coordination of the headquarters response. As you can see, here's her signature on both of these documents here. A response which concealed from the Mexico station Oswald's activities with the DRE and the Free Play for Cuba Committee. Inasmuch as it says, and this is just the last paragraph, our latest information is a State Department report dated May 62. Well, of course, it isn't, because they've got all these reports that they're reading. The very people who are writing and coordinating on this, you can find, there's Jane Roman, there's her signature up there. So, in essence, headquarters is suppressing the story, not informing its Mexico City station of Oswald's Cuban activities in New Orleans and in Dallas. In an interview at which both Jeff and I were present, Jane admitted, she said, quote, I know I'm signing off on something that's not true. Her involvement, however, was minimal, and she told us that whatever operation it was very closely held, and it was in the SAS, which comports very well with the documents being right there in SAS counterintelligence at the time. Both Jeff and I found her account credible when she gave it to us in the mid-1990s, and we still feel she was telling the truth. It's more difficult to know whether John Whitten, the chief of the Mexico and Central America desk and the drafter of the response that concealed the Cuban story, was privy to this SAS Oswald operation. He had greater responsibility for the headquarters response than others, like Jane, who were only in on the coordination. Was he signing off on something he knew wasn't true? If the FBI reports were withheld from him, then he might have believed there was nothing in the file since Oswald had returned to America 18 months earlier. On the other hand, he might have, like Jane, known about the reports, but was told that withholding their contents from the Mexico station was necessary to support some ongoing counterintelligence operation. Whitten died in January 2000 before anyone had a chance to ask him. based on his genuine effort to get at the truth of the Cuban story after the assassination. Jeff and I believe that much of the story was probably withheld from him at the time that he drafted this cable. He was certainly sore after the assassination about the information on the Cuban story that Helms withheld from him then, and you can find that in his HSCA deposition released a couple of years ago. And I think I'm going to turn it back over to Jeff at this point.
This takes us up through October 10th, 1963, as the CIA headquarters registers the information that Oswald has been in Mexico City. Oswald, of course, returns to Dallas, takes a job in the Texas School Book Depository. He has a gun. He's not identified as any kind of threat to the president. On the November 22nd, the motorcade passes by the School Book Depository. Shots ring out. Kennedy is killed. 90 minutes later, Oswald is arrested. How Jane Roman, John Whitten, and George Joannides responded to the development of Oswald's arrest illuminates what the CIA would and would not share with the Warren Commission. John Whitten was working at CIA headquarters that day, and he recalled in one of his reports the effect of the announcement of Oswald's name. And Whitten said the effect was electrifying. Oswald was not an unknown commodity in the Western Hemisphere Division of the CIA. His name meant something to people, and that's why they were electrified. The next day, Whitten immediately began to try and recover all information from CIA files that he could do. And the next day, in a meeting in Deputy Director Helms's office, Helms acquiesced to Whitten's wish to take over the review of all Oswald files. This was a plausible request. Whitten was an experienced counterintelligence investigator. He was one of the leaders in introducing the polygraph to the CIA. It was natural that he would take over such an important investigation. Jane Roman, too, in her description in her interview with me and John, described immediately going to work to see what could be found out about Oswald. In Miami, most tellingly, George Joannides laid low. He received a phone call around 5 o'clock from the members of the DRE, and one of the member who made that phone call has described it in some detail to me. And the members of the DRE called him and said, "We know all about this Oswald fellow. We ran into him in New Orleans, and we're going to publicize everything we know." Joannides reportedly replied, "Let me check with headquarters. I'll get back to you." The DRE didn't wait for his response. They immediately went public, but there's no indication, and this is from the former members of the DRE, 4 of them, Joannides never got back to them to tell them not to go public or not to do what they did. They immediately started calling reporters, and by 6 o'clock, the story of Oswald's activities on behalf of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New Orleans were being broadcast around the world. The next day, the story was featured prominently in the New York Times, Washington Post, Washington Star, Miami Herald, Miami News, and countless other stories. And so in this way, the AMSPEL program that Joannides was running came to shape the initial perception and media coverage of the Kennedy assassination. And in light of Joannides' responsibilities for psychological warfare, this is especially revealing. Joannides stayed in close touch with the group in the days after the assassination. He helped extricate one leading member from Cuba. He did not act like a man who was surprised that his own agents had been in touch with a presidential assassin. He acted like a man who was running a covert operation. And now John's going to pick up with what happens in the days that follow.
When President Kennedy was murdered, there was a huge problem, as insiders like Joannides, Whitten, and Roman, and others immediately recognized. Oswald looked like an agent of Castro in the Kremlin, and the CIA had known about it for 6 weeks before the assassination. And again, I've talked about this and given presentations on this, so I'm not going to show you a lot of documents about that today. Furthermore, Oswald's activities with the Soviet and Cuban embassies in Mexico were in the CIA's records as a result of the fact that a conspirator had impersonated Oswald on the telephone in the Mexican capital. On Saturday morning, just 20 hours after the murder, LBJ and Hoover talked about this very sensitive problem. But within 48 hours, the tapes of that impersonation were made to disappear. At that time or soon after, the cables from the Mexico City CIA station were altered to delete all references to Oswald's Cuban contacts there. In this way, the story of Oswald as Castro Kremlin agent, a story that the CIA itself had helped to create, was eviscerated from the CIA's pre-assassination records. Again, we can discuss this further in the Q&A. But you might also want to contact Ben Wecht, who was the sort of the organizer of that great conference last year, and you can get all the documents that I put together for the presentation there that lay out the evidence for the covering up of, or actually the alteration of those cables and for the suppression of the tape story. But the story itself, that Castro and or the Kremlin might have been behind the president's assassin, was now used to force a national security cover-up. And we'll put the next one on there, Rex. Hoover and Deputy Attorney General Katzenbach worked out the details on Sunday afternoon, and on Monday morning, Katzenbach completed the story in coordination with LBJ's top aide, Bill Moyers. This is the famous Katzenbach memo, and essentially it boils down to this. It has to show that Oswald did it. No conspirators were at large. It was not a communist conspiracy, and furthermore, it was not a right-wing conspiracy dressed up to look like a communist one. Those were the ground rules, and the Warren Commission never wavered from these ground rules, these parameters. President Johnson then used the secret story of Oswald and his Castro-Kremlin ties as leverage to form the Executive Commission to head off any congressional investigation of the president's murder. Let's go to the next one. You may have seen some of these at other parts of this conference. For my purposes, I'll just remind you that this is the leverage being applied to Senator Russell, who did not want the job, was forced into the job, with the argument that 40 million Americans were going to die because of who Oswald was. And let's go to the next one, Rex. Yep. Oh, it's not the one you played? Yeah, you listened to this during Rex's. Oh, okay. Well, my purpose is only in establishing that he's using this World War III threat to pressure people into taking the job, and including the Chief Justice himself, Earl Warren, who refused the job, was asked twice by Bobby Kennedy, ordered down to the White House, refuses Johnson, and then as he says, I just pulled out that little story on Mexico City that Hoover told me, and he had him in tears. He had him crying. Now, unless you, these of course the LBJ tapes, but if you don't believe LBJ, let's take a look at the next one. Earl Warren himself confirmed this story on WETA public television right here in Washington years later, where he told the same story except for he left out the part about crying. But essentially that Johnson said there was a threat of nuclear war, and given that, he said, I'll have to take the job. This ensured that there would be no real investigation. The raison d'etre for the formation of the commission itself was averting a nuclear war. The commission was not told what the CIA knew about Oswald before the assassination, and from its inception, the commission had to comply with the Katzenbach parameters. Oswald had acted alone. There was no communist conspiracy and no right-wing conspiracy. That is the legacy of the Warren Commission, that it never examined the true story of Oswald and the CIA, which is where I feel the smoking gun really lies. And I was invited to make a comparison with the 9/11 Commission, and I'll do that right now and very briefly. I think this legacy has been repeated not just in the 9/11 Commission, but in the joint inquiry as well as the 9/11 Commission, inasmuch as the smoking gun was never examined. And I say that because 2 weeks after 9/11, the FBI announced that they had found the smoking gun in the 9/11 attacks, but 2 weeks later they buried the story completely. And you can ask me more about that at the Q&A if you're interested in it, but I see some parallels there. Jeff?
Since 1963, we've learned a lot about what the Warren Commission didn't know, and particularly with the work of the Review Board in the last, since 1994, we've come to a much clearer picture of CIA pre-assassination knowledge of Oswald. We've also learned a lot about what insiders like Jane Roman, John Whitten, and George Ioannidis did And their responses, not in the immediate aftermath of the assassination, but in the years and decades afterwards, also illuminates what the heart of what the Warren Commission missed. Jane Roman was a very loyal CIA employee. Her husband was a career officer who was very close to Allen Dulles. She never spoke about these matters to anybody until John and I interviewed her. And when we interviewed her, we found her to be quite candid. It was apparent to us that she had not carefully considered what the Oswald paper trail showed. And when we showed her the Oswald paper trail, she described very candidly what it showed to her. And that was that somebody in the agency's special affairs staff, the anti-Castro operation, had a keen interest in Oswald. And that was reflected in the handling of the October 10th, 1963 cable. She said it was these people who had, and she did not know who they were, and I believe that she did not know who they were, had arranged for the dissemination of the inaccurate information to Mexico City about Oswald. She expressed no qualms about this, and she endorsed the Warren Commission's findings in our conversation with her. John Whitten, on the other hand, thought that Oswald's Cuba-related activities had to be investigated. After a couple of weeks after Helms had named him to run the internal file review on Oswald, was nearing completion of his preliminary report when he was allowed to look at the FBI's preliminary report on Oswald as well. And he realized upon reading that report at the White House in early December that Richard Helms and James Angleton had not been sharing all of the CIA's information about Oswald with him. Whitten felt deceived. He immediately returned to CIA headquarters and complained to Helms and Angleton about this. And he related all this in sworn testimony to the HSCA, which was not declassified until 1995. Helms relieved him of his investigatory duties on the spot, and he returned to his other activities in the Western Hemisphere. He only told he finished his career at the CIA and lived out the rest of his life in self-imposed exile in Vienna, Austria. He only told the story once to the HSCA. He did not talk about conspiracy in that deposition, but he did emphasize that he did not think Oswald's background had been properly investigated, and that the question of his Cuba-related activities was one that he was especially interested in. If the investigation had followed his course, he said that he would have gone into Miami and tried to determine what people knew about Oswald's activities there. He was never allowed to do that. I would guess that the reason that he was never allowed to do that is because that would have led him straight into the arms of George Joannides, the man who had been running the Cuban group that had the most contact with Oswald and was busy disseminating the story that Oswald had acted at Castro's behest. George Joannides thought the story of what he had been doing had to be hidden, and he did his best for the rest of his life to make sure that it remained hidden. His role in funding Oswald's antagonists in the DRE was hidden from the Warren Commission. David Slauson confirmed that in a conversation with me recently. The DRE's conspiracy mongering, the public linking of Oswald to Castro was not a subject that Joannides submitted any reports on. And he went, in April 1964, he was reassigned and went on to other assignments in Saigon and Athens. 15 years passed, and in 1978, when the House Select Committee on Assassinations reopened the JFK probe, and the investigators from the HSCA began to go to the CIA asking hard questions and demanding files, the CIA called Joannides out of retirement and put him in charge as the agency's liaison with the congressional investigation. Joannides never disclosed his own role in the events of 1963. When I figured out and obtained the documents and the interviews that described and documented what Joannides had been doing and presented them to Bob Blakey, he was quite astounded. He remembered Joannides well, and so did other investigators on the HSCA. And he said that he had his previous endorsement of CIA cooperation, which he had signed as part of the HSCA report, saying that the congressional investigators had received with the cooperation of the CIA. He said he would now retract that, that this was a violation of trust, that it was his understanding that nobody dealing with the with the investigators would have been operational in 1963. Blakey went so far as to describe Joannides' actions as obstruction of Congress and a felony. And Blakey tells me that he feels that the revelation of Joannides' roles in 1963 and 1978 makes him more inclined to see the CIA's hand in a conspiracy and less inclined to see the mafia. Joannides lived in retirement in Potomac until 1991. When he died, he was never questioned about his knowledge of the events of 1963. So, looking back over these people and the history of what they knew, where do we come down? I think John has made clear Jane Roman clearly had pre-assassination knowledge of Lee Harvey Oswald's activities. She received reports on him. She signed off, but she was in no way witting, and she would be an unwitting participant. John Whitten is a little more deeply involved because he had authority to sign off on those cables about Oswald in October 1963. So if there were inaccurate statements putting out, he bears some responsibility. Unfortunately, all the documentary evidence that's around this was never able to be presented to John Whitten. I was looking for him in the late 1990s and had tracked him to Austria, but by that time he had moved to a nursing home in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, where he died, so we were never able to question him. George Joannides is a different story. He never reported his contact between his agents and an accused presidential assassin, and every CIA officer who I've talked to regards that as either highly improper or highly implausible. Every CIA officer I talked to said that Joannides was under a firm legal, professional obligation to report the contacts between the DRE and Oswald as their case officer. Several CIA officers said that due to the sensitivity of the material, he might have done so orally and not on paper. I do believe that may be true. But if so, we have no record, and there is no record anywhere of what Joannides reported. The fact that he returns to the JFK story 15 years later and is in a position to thwart congressional investigators asking about these matters, I think has to be taken as an indication of bad faith. He was more than an unwitting participant. I don't think that there is no evidence that he had advanced knowledge of a plot, so he certainly could not be called or suggested in any way that he was a co-conspirator. But he does seem to have been an accessory after the fact to hide what the CIA knew about Oswald before the assassination. In legal terms, I think I would describe him as an unindicted co-conspirator. And with that, we'll close and take questions. Microphone?
Because we need somebody up here with a microphone to sort of hand it up to.
Thank you. I have been going over a lot of the same ground recently, and I want to concur and expand on some of what you said. First, with a general point, Whitten was a stand-up guy. He was one of the few CIA witnesses before any of the bodies who really wanted to provide some real information. One of the things I felt I learned from his testimony, which is very connected to what you're saying, is that inside the CIA, nobody knows anything about what anybody else is doing. It's set up that way. That's the way it's supposed to run. Now, getting specific, and this was explained by another helpful witness, for the most part, Sam Halpern, who was the deputy of Desmond Fitzgerald, who was the head of SAS, and who explained that SAS had been set up in 1963 or late 62 as the Get Castro branch. That was its job, and it was fully independent from the rest of Western Hemisphere. And actually, Jeff, the one thing I would question what you said, although you may know more than I do, is Joannides reporting directly to Helms. I would have thought he would have reported directly to Fitzgerald, but that's only supposition on my part. Now, thus, it makes perfect sense that if SAS knew something about Oswald, which other people didn't, which I think they did, they would have wanted that FBI report in their custody, and it makes perfect sense that they would have allowed this cable traffic that originated in Mexico City and went back to be handled by somebody else in WH4 when they knew the truth. Now, the other point I want to make has to do with the Warren Commission. Scelso, as you point out, was originally appointed head of the investigation and head liaison to the Warren Commission to respond to inquiries. What? No, Scelso.
Scelso is Witten.
Is Witten, okay. That was wrong in the sense that if you really wanted the liaison to be the person who would know the relevant information about attempts to kill Castro, etc., it would have been somebody from SAS. It would have been Fitzgerald or a deputy of his. So they've already pushed it one level away from the people who know anything. But what I found fascinating was even that wasn't good enough, and it had to be moved yet further away to Angleton, who had absolutely nothing to do with it. So I really applaud what you're doing, but I think this is a very important thing to understand about the CIA, and it's totally different from the FBI, where information is constantly freely shared. The CIA is set up to do the opposite. And lastly, yes, most important point of all, Halpern was being questioned about the Amlash case, and somebody from the Church Committee had seen the Amlash file, and there was a note on the Amlash file that this file wasn't supposed to go out of the branch, that is, out of SAS, without the permission of the case officer. And Halpern explained that that was more or less normal procedure, and in fact, that if you asked SAS, has Lee Harvey Oswald worked for you? He didn't use that name, but this is what he was saying. And if the case officer for Lee Harvey Oswald didn't want anybody outside SAS to know, then they would not find out. I mean, it's as simple as that. I mean, well, you wouldn't ask did he work for you. You would ask for information about Lee Harvey Oswald, but that specific piece of information would not be provided. Halpern was very clear if you didn't want to provide it.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, David. I'd just like to make 3 comments in response to that. First of all, yes, the information was very tightly held. I think the importance of Jane Roman's testimony to John and I was that the information was being held in SAS, and it was the intentionality that she was talking about, that somebody was taking action with regard to Oswald's file, fully knowing that he was an object of their interest. We don't know who those people were, but I believe, Jane, that they were in Special Affairs staff. Who George Joannides reported to is a very good question. He was supposed to submit monthly reports on the DRE. All the case officers in Miami did this. We have the reports on the DRE from September 1960 up to November 1962. Joannides takes over the handling of the DRE in December 1962, and that's when the paper trail on that's when the monthly reports on the Amspell operation stop. There are no monthly reports on the DRE for the next 17 months until April 1964, when Joannides is reassigned to Athens, and then the monthly reports on the Amspell program start again. So what happened was Joannides reporting in writing? Those records have never surfaced. Sure.
There may not be monthly reports, but there are a tremendous number of reports on specific things.
Yes, but the case officer's synthesis of what's going on with the group, there's a 17-month gap, and it coincides exactly with Joannides' handling of the group. And a third point on Sam Halpern, I think his testimony on this point is well taken, and the point's well taken there. But I interviewed Sam Halpern twice with the tape recorder going, and asked him who ran the DRE in Miami on behalf of the CIA in 1963. And he told me in 2 separate interviews that he had no idea. After I uncovered Joannides' personnel file and demonstrated that he was handling the group, he sent word through his friends in the chat groups that he knew all about George Joannides. George Joannides was a stand-up guy and wouldn't have had anything to do with the Kennedy assassination. So we can see that there's a level of unwillingness of CIA insiders to come clean about what Joannides was doing in 1963, and we still don't fully know. Sure.
John Newman said to ask in the Q&A about found the smoking gun.
The 9/11 smoking gun? Yeah, okay.
No, not the 9/11 smoking.
Well, when I wrote Oswald in the CIA at the time, we could see that there was something terribly wrong with a lot of the reports, the inaccuracies, and I remember talking to Jeff about it at the time, and didn't have a framework for putting it together. So we just called it Smoke 1, Smoke 2, Smoke 3, Smoke 4 in the chapter of the smoking file. But years later, as I had time to reflect on it and went back to the archives and looked at more of the records, less redacted, it occurred to me what we were looking at were two parts of the problem. There was one part to create the story. The other part was to suppress it until 11/22, because if you didn't suppress it, Oswald isn't going to be in the window up there with a gun. He's a very threatening profile, if you think about it. Two-time defecting commie pinko, ex-Marine who threatened to give classified information to the Russians in front of the U.S. consul in the Soviet Union. And then he's down there in Mexico City meeting with a KGB assassin, Valery Kostakov, and all this sort of stuff. So if the story is told, if the DRE story is revealed to the station, it escalates his profile, which was already bad enough. But there were a number of other things that I pointed out in the book at the time. The turning off of the alert status on Oswald and the FBI the very day the Mexico Story City hit. The failure to provide the Mexico City station with the photographs of Oswald they asked for, and I could go on. There's about 10 things, and when I looked at them collectively, they all look like suppression of a story, keeping a virus dormant, if you will, until 11/22, at which time it played out in its role and helped head off any true investigation. I mean, how do you murder the President of the United States and ensure that the CIA and the FBI aren't going to investigate it? You needed a World War III story or something like that to function like that. So that's why I felt in the out years that the real smoking gun was the pre-assassination, not just the cooking up of the story, but controlling it, suppressing it. And it took firemen in various places, some in the CIA and some in the FBI, to do it. And that's my operating concept right now. I might be wrong, but that's the way it's beginning to look to me. And I think I might pass on 9/11 for sake of time, unless you really want me to go into that. John, you do? Yeah, you got a question back. Okay.
About 9/11, you've made reference to a smoking gun in the 9/11
Yeah.
Commission. I just would like to hear what you were referring to.
All right. Well, I've been working on it for about the past 5 months. I have about 7 chapters written, so I'll try and do it in 1 minute. The FBI, you know, Al-Qaeda didn't acknowledge that they did this thing right away. So we thought that they did, and so the name of the game for the first couple of weeks was to find out the evidence. And it turned out to be evidence of money transfers from the United Arab Emirates, and in particular one individual. And so when they discovered these wire transfers, the FBI announced to Newsweek and other organizations, we found the smoking gun linking bin Laden to this case. Well, 2 weeks later, they found out who this individual was. He was a British agent, Omar Ahmed Saeed Sheikh, who had kidnapped Americans, kidnapped British, caused deaths, and who had never been brought to justice because we didn't indict him and we didn't put him in prison, neither did the British, because he was our penetration of the senior Al-Qaeda leadership, had trained the pilots how to live in the West, in Pakistan, and working all the time with the head of Pakistani intelligence and the 2 of the 3 key corps commanders in Pakistan were his bosses. The FBI found this out 2 weeks later when they examined Omar's cell phone records. And it showed the conversations with the ISI chief, that's the head of Pakistani intelligence, and how the last $100,000 was actually obtained and given to Atta here, and that was that they kidnapped an Indian shoe sales tycoon, ransomed about $830,000 or so from him, sent $100,000 of it to Omar in UAE, and that last $100,000 are transferred on August 14th here, with which they used to buy the airline tickets to fly their recon missions and their final flights. But it couldn't have come at a worse time. The revelation of those phone records occurred on the 8th of October, the very day that British and American forces were going in to Afghanistan. And it was about the worst thing you could discover, that a British agent who had been let off the hook for his crimes by the Americans and the British, because we thought he was our window, in fact our only window into the senior Al-Qaeda leadership, was a very damaging story for Musharraf, who we needed as an ally, for Tony Blair, and for the Bush administration. And that was who the smoking gun really turned out to be, and that story was suppressed. And it takes a lot of time to tell you how it was and what the media coverage was, but within 3 weeks it was gone. And by the way, he is the person who murdered Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl a few months later.
Getting back to Kennedy.
Yes.
I want to commend Jeff and John for the great work they've done. And I think it's, moved all of our understanding forward. And I think they're to be commended. And Jeff, I hope you get your book contract to put this all in book form. I'm curious, it seems from what you've said that you can have a benign kind of analysis of what was happening with the DRE and Joanides and Oswald up until November 22nd. I mean, Oswald was a strange character, ex-Soviet defector. Surely our intelligence is going to be monitoring him. But I'm very curious what happens immediately after the assassination, as you point out, with news stories, with various disinformation pieces being circulated, then immediately after the assassination, about Oswald and his connection to the communist world. And I wonder, I don't think you mentioned David Phillips, but obviously he's a key figure, he seems, in a lot of people's research. Who do you feel was disseminating this information about Oswald immediately after? Was it just the DRE? Were they doing it under orders from someone within the agency, and if so, who?
You take that question. I'll do Phillips.
It's a good question, and it's a little bit unclear. The members of the DRE didn't need any prodding to jump on the story of Lee Harvey Oswald, and I think that was probably by design. There are possible benign interpretations of what was going on in August 1963 that would render Joanides either incompetent, that he simply missed Oswald, missed his significance, failed to report on him, and that he subsequently after that had to hide that. Mitigating against that is the fact that in April 1964, George Joanides, on his job evaluation in every category, received a 99 or higher rating, the highest possible rating he could have received. So he had the total confidence of his superiors, whatever he knew. He did not fail to do anything that his superiors wanted to do in 1963. That's the first point. A second point, Oswald's biography became known very quickly. The importance of the Amspell operation is that they deliver factual confirmation of a Cuban connection, not merely of Oswald's general leftist inclination or his time in the Soviet Union, but his recent activities in the recent past on behalf of a pro-Castro organization, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. So their impact is very strong on the first day's coverage of the assassination. Other people are also doing that. I should say, too, that the DRE's campaign to link Oswald and Castro was not limited to just these phone calls to reporters on the night of November 22nd. One member of the DRE called Claire Booth Luce, the wife of Henry Luce, the editor of Time Life magazine, probably the most influential figure in American journalism. Claire Booth Luce told the story of receiving a call from a DRE member late on the night of the 22nd and telling her that the DRE had hard evidence that Oswald had been working for a Cuban assassination team in Mexico City. Well, whatever we make of that story, the remarkable thing about it is that the caller from the DRE knew that Oswald had been in Mexico City. At that point, the night of November 22nd, there were a handful of CIA people, and J. Edgar Hoover were the only, and people in the CIA station in Mexico were the only people who knew it. How did a 27-year-old engineer, head of the DRE, how did he know that Oswald had been in Mexico City? We don't know. I think the figure of David Phillips is important in understanding the larger context, and John's going to talk a little bit about him.
Yeah, I actually wrote something in Probe many years ago about this, not very much. So if any of you have that, or the person who asked the question, you might want to go back and look at that. So right off the top of my head, it's very interesting. At the time that Lee Harvey Oswald was in Mexico City, somebody was promoted to head of covert operations for Cuba at that time, and that was David Atlee Phillips. In fact, it wasn't just it was a promotion not just for the job he was doing, but GS-15. He forever. If you look at his personnel record, he hadn't been promoted forever, for over 10 years, I think. I'm just doing this from memory now. But sure enough, when Oswald went to Mexico City, David Atlee Phillips is promoted to a GS-15, which is kind of, that's the benchmark to get. And if you're a government service person here, you know what I'm talking about. GS-15 is sort of, bottom rung of the club. And even more intriguing than that is that during that 3-day period I was talking about before, when the DRE Oswald story crashes into CIA headquarters, on those 3 days, 8, 9, 10 October, and this cable exchange is going on between headquarters and the station, he takes this TDY to Miami, and I think probably to headquarters too, although I don't have any evidence for it, but there is evidence in the files that shows the flight arrangements on Eastern Airlines, I believe, to Miami and back and going to JM Wave. So he's coordinating something with JM Wave at the very time these cables are exchanged. And I'd make one other point. His testimony to the HSCA is one of the reasons that we know that those cables from the station were altered. There are others who also remember having put in the cables. In fact, practically everybody who was in the Mexico City station said so to the HSCA or to the review board under oath that they did report Oswald's contacts with the Cuban consulate and so on. But Phillips told an even better story to the Washington Post. And this is the missing, in my book, if you're familiar with it, the missing transcript of Monday, where he talks about receiving money in exchange for information. Phillips was deeply involved in Cuban operations, and he ended up taking it over at the very time that Oswald brings his FPCC credentials and the Cuban story into the Mexican capital, and they send all these reports back and forth to headquarters about it. So he's in the middle of it, but and of course this is completely separate from what Gate and Fonzie did and all the rest of it. But when I got in to put the electron microscope on Mexico City, I found him. There he was, right in the middle of the story.
One addendum to that is David Atlee Phillips was stationed in Havana in 1960 when the Revolutionary Student Directorate was first formed by anti-Castro students on the University of Havana campus. Phillips recruited the members of the organization, and when they faced suppression from the Castro forces on campus, helped them to migrate to Miami and establish the operation there. So David Atlee Phillips was in on the creation of the Revolutionary Student Directorate. He was its case officer at the very beginning. He praises the group quite highly in his biography, as does Howard Hunt. So the use of the DRE as an instrument of U.S. policy in the early 1960s, I think, is very clearly established. And so to David's question about who's guiding this thing, we don't know exactly, but I think that the fact that David Phillips is the godfather of the DRE within the CIA speaks very strongly to his knowledge and intentions around the group. Yeah, Brett.
Yeah, Mike, thanks. You're going over George, how do you pronounce his last name again?
Joanides.
Joanides, okay. I studied a little bit about the Cuban Student Directorate, and one of the things that I found out was that they seemed to show up in different places where there was a conflict between them and some pro-Castro elements. And I'm not talking about Oswald in New Orleans, but particularly Tampa, Florida, which I did a thesis on. And in November and December of 1961, there were some demonstrations in Tampa which had a large pro-Castro community, and which there were demonstrations, and at the demonstrations there were anti-Castro Cubans, particularly the Cuban Revolutionary Council and the DRE attended some of these demonstrations. Around the same time, Guy Bannister was working out of the same office in New Orleans with the Cuban Revolutionary Council, the same small building, and they were well aware of each other's presence. The thing is, what I'm trying to find out from you is now, and you mentioned Joanides became head of the, or rather directed the operation of the DRE in, what was it, December 62? I think
Yes.
you gave me the date?
Yes.
Okay, because the DRE was getting in conflicts, like the CRC was, with the pro-Castro Cubans in Tampa, and I was wondering if you have any evidence that this was a specific purpose of the DRE to basically get involved in little scuffles with pro-Castro elements in the United States.
Absolutely it was. And you saw on Joanides' job evaluation, he was supporting the group for political action, intelligence collection, and propaganda. And so these confrontations with pro-Castro groups were part of why the agency was funding them. And this continued throughout. In September 1963, just a couple weeks after the DRE's encounters with Oswald, Joanides gives 4 leaders of the DRE $660 to travel to New York City to take on a group of pro-Castro students who had just returned from Cuba, spending the summer there, and were going to speak out in defense of what Castro was doing. The DRE leaders went there, provoked a brawl in Town Hall that turned into a mini riot in the streets of Times Square, and this was clearly what Joanides intended, because he gave them the money to go do it. And to strengthen one of the reasons why I believe Joanides' hand is so deeply involved in this, on the way back, 2 of those members of the DRE are invited to give testimony to the House Un-American Committee's activity, the House Un-American Activities Committee, about pro-Castro activity in the United States. So that's what the DRE's purpose was. That's why the CIA was funding them.
The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, later on, they were investigating the Fair Play for Cuba Committee as far back as 1960. They talked to people like Robert Tabor, and V.T. Lee testified in February of '63, and William C. Kramer, the congressman from St. Petersburg, Florida, who was the biggest foe of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in Congress, testified and talked about a huge way to bring people in this country who were pro-Castro, that Castro was sending his agents in the United States. May have been true, I don't know if his particular trail of...
The Fair Play for Cuba Committee was definitely funded by the Cuban government, and this rankled people at the CIA to no end, because...
Well, Santos Bush was, apparently claimed that Robert Tabor received $1,000 or $6,000.
I don't think there's any doubt that the Fair Play for Cuba Committee got support from the Cuban government.
That kind of counter-propaganda was the DRE's job all over the Western Hemisphere.
Correct.
They had offices all over the Western Hemisphere.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
I just wanted to elaborate for a second on the issue of the falsification of the record on Mexico City and ask for comment.
John.
I know in Ray Rocca's deposition to the HSCA, which became public recently, he asked at one point, well, where are all the earlier cables? So even people in Washington, not just from Mexico City, recognize the discrepancy in the story. And also, John had mentioned David Phillips' story in the Washington Post in '76 about this missing tape. If you read the 2 transcripts of the purported Oswald tapes, they're fairly innocuous. There's a couple of disturbing things in them, like where Oswald is supposed to have said, well, the Cubans have my address, and also the name Kostakov, or a version of it, shows up. But also, at the day after Phillips relayed the story about this missing conversation with somewhat more sinister connotations to the House, they flew down to Guadalajara, Mexico, and interviewed the 2 Tarasov translators and got them both to provide the same story in much more detail. Boris Tarasov, a year and a half later, before the HSCA in the Blakey era, retracted his story, although Anna did not. And I think it ties into this notion of the bombshell coming up from Mexico City on the 22nd, and we don't even really know exactly what that bombshell was, I think, at this point, because the likelihood that the tape of the phone conversation is something which itself is not even in the record at this point.
Yeah, it's both the tapes and the story of his Cuban contacts down there. All that had to go away. I don't want to get into the tapes right now. It would take too much time. I've done that many times. 90% of you have heard that before, and those of you who haven't, please contact Ben Wecht and you can get the whole interview. But I will say, I think it's even more, not even more pernicious, but it's a real problem that if those cables were altered. Now, the first guy who really pushed this button, and I think was probably fired partly for that, was Richard Sprague, who's head of the HSCA. He ran into this. They were investigating this. And, of course, when they talked to the people from the Mexico station, they found out the same thing the review board did. All of them say that this missing conversation we're talking about, but all of his contacts with the Cuban consulate reported. Angleton's replacement at headquarters, Colares, wrote a memo in which he said that the cables in October contained information on Oswald's Cuban contacts. I know that the review board tried to get their arms around this, and maybe tomorrow Jeremy Gunn, if somebody can ask him if you're here about this issue, by examining the serials very closely to try and get a handle on whether or not they could establish that some were missing or there'd been some hanky-panky, and they were so disorganized that they were unable to do this, which is ridiculous because the little ladies in tennis shoes were meticulous at the CIA, if you've ever seen that huge file. So right at the point, at the fulcrum, when Oswald's in Mexico City and these cables are exchanged, it's just disheveled. There's serials missing. You can't tell anything from it. For me, it's something that really makes me mad when I think about it now. We try and put the record back together again, and it's gone. It's just not there. The tapes we know a little bit more about because we can interview people who listen to them, like Slauson, who finally came clean with the review board at long last, that yes, he had listened to him, a rumor that we'd heard for, 25 years in the research community, based on a phone conversation with our good British friend at the poolside with Coleman. But yeah, the issue of falsifying the story out of Mexico City, I think is very important, because what the CIA is doing is hiding what it knew about Oswald's Cuban story before the assassination. And that's the very story that was used to leverage the Warren Commission into being.
We've got one over here. I'm curious if you guys have thought about why the SAS would be so keenly interested in Oswald at a time when Oswald is so keenly interested in getting into Cuba.
Yeah, let me say, you can take this one too. I'm not going to go expansive on my answer to that, but I want to bring up one specific thing that the Church Committee, I think it was volume 5 or 6, it's been a long time, so I don't remember which one. And it's still classified, but this the report that I'm going to refer to, but the report is referred to in a footnote in volume 5 or 6 of the Church Committee, in which it said that the CIA informed the FBI at the time of Oswald's visit that they to Mexico City, that they were going to conduct an operation against the FPCC to embarrass it, and they were going to disseminate misleading information to embarrass the FPCC in other countries. And it's just in a footnote. And I've written on that, I've pointed that out in a couple of places, but the reason I bring that up and answer your question, you ask, why would they be interested in the DRE, or excuse me, why would the SAS be interested? Because they were interested in discrediting the FPCC, for one. So that would be actually a legitimate operation. And that's the way I conceive of all of this happening, of Witten signing off on stuff that he knows isn't true, that there are legitimate counterintelligence operations going on in the SAS within which a conspirator could depress the virus until 11/22. Okay, so the people that are doing this inside the SAS, I don't see them either as witting conspirators, although there might have been a fireman over there. I just don't know who. You might know better if you've been talking to Sam Halpern and those guys and opening up this echelon at the top of the SAS, including Fitzgerald. But I'll just leave it at that. Did you want to add anything to that question? Yeah.
No, I thought, Jeff, it might be a good idea if you could inform people about your current efforts to get information, because it bears on a couple of things, including the new problems that have arisen since the JFK board went out of existence.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to do that. Just one additional note on David Phillips. I do want to say, I believe that the interest in Oswald that is manifested by the DRE's contacts with him in August 1963 probably was related to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. John, in his book, sketches a very interesting counterintelligence operations that CIA people did against Fair Play for Cuba activists earlier
Back in 60.
Earlier in 1960, and David Phillips was deeply involved in those. So I don't think, I think that's the explanation for the nature of the interest. Last December, I filed a year ago, I filed a FOIA to the CIA requesting all records on George Joannides. They wrote back and said that they had disclosed everything to the JFK Review Board, which clearly wasn't true. So in December, I filed a lawsuit with Jim representing me and made another request for all Joannides related material. The CIA came back and acknowledged finally that they do have George Joannides material. We then requested that they provide us with the easily accessible documents that didn't need to be referred to other agencies immediately and hold off on releasing the other material that had to be cleared with other agencies till later in the year. The CIA opposed that motion, and the judge recently supported their motion. So the way the lawsuit stands now is the CIA has promised to release George Joannides material in December of this year.
Slight correction. They've promised in December to report on whether or not there's any information to be released.
Okay.
You have to understand how the CIA works.
Okay. Special Affairs Staff. Okay, we're done.
Any further questions? Okay, our next panel is not scheduled to meet for another 15 minutes, so we can either go ahead or let's take a break. We had a short break earlier.
Yeah.